The dust settled on the lone road leading into Silverridge, Colorado, as Delilah Thorne stared at her family's dilapidated ranch house, with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. 3 months after her father's burial, the bank's final notice had come this morning: pay the remaining debt of $500 by month's end, or lose everything the Thornes had built over 2 generations. Standing in the doorway of what was once a promising cattle operation, Delilah squeezed the paper until her knuckles turned white, knowing there wasn't a penny to spare, let alone a small fortune. The year was 1876, and the harsh reality of frontier life showed no mercy to a 22-year-old woman alone in the world. The drought had withered their crops, sickness had thinned their herd, and her father's slow decline had drained what little savings they'd managed to set aside. Now, with only a handful of cattle and acres of parched land, Delilah faced the impossible. Her reverie was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Shielding her eyes against the setting sun, she watched a rider approach along the dusty road. Even from a distance, she recognized the tall figure of Xander Hayes, owner of the sprawling Double H ranch that bordered her family's modest spread. His black Stetson and broad shoulders were unmistakable, just as his reputation for shrewd business dealings was well known throughout the county. Delilah straightened her faded blue dress and hastily wiped her eyes. The last thing she needed was pity from a man whose cattle empire seemed to grow each time a smaller ranch failed. She'd heard the whispers in town that Hayes had his eye on Thorne land to expand his grazing territory. "Evening, Miss Thorne," Xander called as he approached, tipping his hat respectfully. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. At 32, the lines around his eyes spoke of years squinting against the Colorado sun, but there was a kindness in his expression that contradicted his ruthless reputation. "Mr. Hayes," she replied coolly, "what brings you to Thorne Ranch?" He approached slowly, leading his chestnut stallion. "I was passing by and thought I'd check in, heard about your troubles with the bank." He paused, studying her with those intense green eyes. "Sheriff Wilson mentioned you received the final notice today." Delilah's spine stiffened. "News travels fast. Small towns rarely keep secrets," Xander said, his voice softer than she expected. "I've come with a proposition." "I'm not selling," she said immediately, crossing her arms. "Not to you or anyone else." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not here to buy your land, Miss Thorne. I need a ranch manager for my north pasture. The position comes with fair wages enough to settle your debt with the bank and keep this place running." Delilah narrowed her eyes. "Why would you hire me?" "Because everyone knows Thomas Thorne taught his daughter everything about ranching, and I've seen how you handle cattle better than most men in these parts." He gestured toward her struggling herd. "Your father was respected for his knowledge. I assume that wisdom didn't die with him." The compliment caught her off guard, but suspicion quickly replaced any warmth the words might have kindled. The Hayes Ranch had dozens of experienced hands. This sudden offer felt too convenient. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Hayes," she said firmly. Xander's expression remained unchanged. "It's not charity when it's an honest job offer, Miss Thorne. I need someone I can trust managing that section of my property." "And why would you trust me?" she challenged. "Because a woman fighting this hard to keep her home has more integrity than half the drifters looking for work." He handed her a folded paper. "Here are the terms. Think about it. You have until tomorrow." Before she could refuse, he mounted his horse and tipped his hat once more. "Good evening, Miss Thorne." Delilah watched him ride away, the paper heavy in her hand. Only when he disappeared over the hill did she unfold it, eyes widening at the figure written there. The monthly salary would cover the bank debt within 3 months, with enough left to begin restoring her own ranch. It was generous, suspiciously so. That night, Delilah sat at her kitchen table, the oil lamp casting long shadows as she considered her options. Pride demanded she refuse Hayes's offer, but practicality whispered that beggars couldn't afford principles. The ranch had been her home since birth, the only connection she had left to her parents. Losing it would mean losing everything. At dawn, she saddled her mare and rode to the Double H Ranch. The main house stood imposing against the mountains, 2 stories of solid craftsmanship that made her own home look like little more than a shack. Ranch hands were already busy in the corrals, and the smell of breakfast wafted from the cookhouse, where at least 15 men would be eating. Xander Hayes emerged from the barn as if he'd been expecting her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Thorne," he greeted, no surprise in his voice. "Your offer," she began, voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'll accept it, but only as a business arrangement. I won't be beholden to you or anyone else." A slight smile crossed his face. "I wouldn't expect anything less. You can start today if you'd like. Jenkins can show you the North Pasture operation after breakfast." "That won't be necessary. I know the land. My father and I rode it often enough when checking our boundaries." She paused. "I'll need to tend to my own cattle mornings and evenings." "Of course." He gestured toward the cookhouse. "At least join us for breakfast before you start." The invitation seemed harmless, yet something in his manner made Delilah wary. She'd heard rumors of his past, a Boston-educated rancher who turned a modest inheritance into one of the largest operations in the territory through cunning and determination. Some said he was fair, others claimed he was merciless in business. None seemed to know the real man. "Another time, perhaps," she answered. "I'd rather see the operation first." Respect flickered in his eyes. "As you wish." The North Pasture was even larger than Delilah had realized, stretching for acres with lush grass fed by a creek that had somehow remained flowing despite the drought. The cattle looked healthy, far better than her own thin herd. "You've diverted water," she observed, noticing the small dam upstream. "Careful irrigation," Xander corrected, riding alongside her. "We channeled just enough to maintain this pasture without taking from downstream ranchers." "Like the Thornes?" she asked pointedly. He met her gaze directly. "Your creek runs from a different watershed, Miss Thorne. Your drought troubles aren't of my making." The truth stung. She'd secretly hoped to find evidence of wrongdoing, something to justify her distrust of this man and his unexpected generosity. "The foreman's cabin is there," he continued, pointing to a small but well-maintained structure near a stand of pines. "It's been empty since Johnson left for California. You're welcome to use it when working late, rather than riding back to your place." "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. The thought of sleeping on Hayes' property made her uncomfortable. "As you prefer." He dismounted near a holding pen where several hands were separating cattle. "These are the new calves that need branding. Jackson can show you our system." For the next several hours, Delilah worked alongside Hayes's men, who regarded her with curiosity but increasing respect as they witnessed her skill with the animals. By midday, she was covered in dust and sweat, but had earned silent nods of approval from even the most skeptical cowboys. When she returned home that evening, exhausted but with the first day's wages in her pocket, Delilah finally allowed herself to consider that perhaps this arrangement might work after all. She could save the ranch, maintain her independence, and maybe even expand her own herd once the debt was cleared. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Delilah rose before dawn to tend her cattle, rode to the North Pasture to manage Hayes's operation during the day, then returned home to work her own land until darkness fell. The punishing schedule left little time for rest, but each day brought her closer to financial security. What she hadn't anticipated was Xander Hayes's consistent presence. Rather than leaving her to work independently, he frequently rode alongside her, discussing cattle breeds, grazing rotation, and market prices. His knowledge impressed her, though she was reluctant to admit it. "You're working yourself into the ground," he commented one evening as they rode the boundary line. The sunset painted the hills gold and crimson, a beauty Delilah was too tired to fully appreciate. "I'm doing what needs to be done," she replied, straightening in her saddle to hide her fatigue. "There's a difference between determination and foolishness." His voice held no judgment, merely observation. "You won't save your ranch if you work yourself to death." "I don't recall asking for your concern, Mr. Hayes." "Xander," he corrected. "After a month of working together, I think we can dispense with formalities." She didn't respond, unwilling to acknowledge the slight warming she felt toward him. Every time her guard began to lower, she reminded herself of his position and her employer and desperate employee, powerful rancher and struggling neighbor. That night, a sudden thunderstorm broke the drought's grip on the land. Delilah stood on her porch, watching lightning split the sky as rain drenched the parched earth. Relief flooded through her until a terrifying thought struck: the creek that bordered her property would flood, potentially washing away her cattle in their low-lying pasture. Without hesitation, she mounted her horse and rode through the downpour toward the creek, heart pounding with fear. The water was already rising, rushing angrily between its banks as her cattle huddled nervously near the edge. "Hiya," she shouted, attempting to drive them toward higher ground. The spooked animals bellowed in confusion, some moving in the wrong direction as thunder crashed overhead. Her mare, frightened by the storm, became increasingly difficult to control. Then, through the curtain of rain, came riders, 3 of them, moving with purpose toward her cattle. For a panicked moment, Delilah thought rustlers were taking advantage of the chaos, until she recognized Xander's tall figure leading the group. Without a word, they joined her efforts, expertly herding the cattle away from the dangerous waters. One calf, separated from its mother, began drifting downstream in the swollen creek. Without hesitation, Xander dismounted and waded into the rushing water, grabbing the struggling animal and carrying it to safety. By the time the cattle were secure on higher ground, all 4 riders were drenched and mud-covered. Delilah's hands trembled from cold and fading adrenaline as she approached Xander, who was checking the rescued calf. "You didn't have to do that," she said, voice barely audible above the rain. He looked up, water dripping from his hat brim. "Neighbors help neighbors, Miss Thorne. That's how we survive out here." "How did you know?" she asked. "I was checking my own boundary line when I saw you ride out." He straightened, handing the calf to one of his men. "The creek floods every time we get a heavy rain. I figured you might need assistance." The simple explanation did nothing to diminish the weight of his actions. These cattle represented her livelihood, her future. In saving them, he'd done far more than offer employment. He'd helped secure her independence. "Thank you," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate. Xander nodded, then gestured to his men. "Jackson and Peters will stay with your herd tonight to make sure they don't wander back toward the creek. You should get inside before you catch your death." "I can watch my own cattle," she protested weakly, though exhaustion was evident in her voice. "I don't doubt it," he replied, "but even the strongest among us occasionally need rest." His eyes met hers, and something in his steady gaze silenced her objections. "Just for tonight," she conceded. The next morning, Delilah found not only her cattle safe, but also repairs made to a section of fence that had washed away. Jackson and Peters tipped their hats as they rode out, refusing her offers of breakfast or payment. When she arrived at the north pasture later that day, Xander made no mention of the previous night's events. Instead, he presented her with a ledger. "I'd like you to review the breeding records," he said. "Your father was known for his eye for good bloodlines. I'm interested in your opinion on which bulls we should acquire for next season." The request surprised her. These weren't minor decisions but choices that would affect the profitability of his entire operation for years to come. "You're trusting me with this?" she asked cautiously. "I hired you for your expertise, not just your ability to move cattle from one field to another." He handed her the leather-bound book. "Take your time with it." That evening, instead of immediately returning home, Delilah found herself sitting on the porch of the foreman's cabin, studying the Hayes breeding records by lantern light. The thoroughness impressed her, each animal's lineage carefully documented, along with notations about temperament, size, and hardiness. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice Xander approaching until his shadow fell across the page. He carried 2 steaming cups, offering one to her. "Coffee?" he asked. She accepted, grateful for the warmth as the evening air cooled. "You keep meticulous records." "My father taught me that good ranching is equal parts instinct and information." He settled into a chair beside her, respectfully maintaining distance. "What have you found?" For the next hour, they discussed cattle breeding with the intensity of scholars debating philosophy. Delilah found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation, impressed by Xander's knowledge and his willingness to consider her suggestions. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly when they finished. "Not many ranchers twice your age have such understanding of the business." The unexpected praise warmed her more than the coffee. "He wanted a son," she admitted, "but made do with teaching his daughter instead." "I'd say he did more than make do," Xander replied. "You're one of the most capable ranchers I've met, regardless of gender." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a connection that transcended employer and employee. Delilah looked away first, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the moment. "It's getting late," she said, standing abruptly. "I should head back." "At least let me ride with you," he offered. "The creek might still be high." She wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance she'd carefully cultivated, but practicality won out. "Thank you." The ride back to Thorne Ranch passed mostly in comfortable silence, the night air filled with the chorus of crickets and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Occasionally, their shoulders would brush as the trail narrowed, each brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through Delilah. Despite the cool evening, at her gate, Xander dismounted to open it for her, then hesitated before she could ride through. "There's a social at the church this Saturday," he said. "Most of the county will be there." "I'm aware," she replied, uncertain where he was heading. "Would you consider attending with me?" His directness caught her off guard. "Not as my employee," he added quickly, "but as my guest." Delilah stared at him, searching for the ulterior motive behind the invitation. Finding none in his steady gaze, she found herself more unsettled than if she'd detected deception. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Hayes. People would talk." "People always talk," he said with a slight smile. "The question is whether we give their words any weight. Our arrangement is business," she reminded him, as much for herself as for him. "It's better to keep it that way." Disappointment flickered across his features, quickly masked. "As you wish, Miss Thorne. Good night." She watched him ride away, trying to ignore the small voice asking if she'd made the right choice. Saturday arrived with Delilah convincing herself she'd been wise to decline Xander's invitation. She dressed in her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had sewn years ago, and rode into Silverridge alone. The church's social would provide a welcome distraction from her increasingly confused feelings about her employer. The town was bustling with activity, families from outlying ranches mingling with townspeople in the churchyard where tables laden with food awaited. Children chased each other while mothers gossiped and fathers discussed cattle prices. It was a scene of community that made Delilah acutely aware of her solitude. Delilah Thorne, as I live and breathe. Martha Wilson, the sheriff's wife, approached with open arms. We've barely seen you in town these past weeks. I've been busy at the ranch, Delilah explained, accepting the older woman's embrace. And working for Xander Hayes, we hear, added Beatrice Collins, the shopkeeper's wife, with obvious curiosity. How is that arrangement going? The subtle emphasis on arrangement wasn't lost on Delilah. It's been beneficial, she replied neutrally. Mr. Hayes runs an efficient operation. I'm sure he does, Beatrice said with a knowing look that made Delilah's cheeks warm. He's quite the catch, you know. Half the single women in the county have set their caps for him since he arrived 3 years ago. I'm not interested in Mr. Hayes beyond our business relationship, Delilah stated firmly. Martha patted her arm sympathetically. Of course, dear, though it wouldn't be the worst match. He's respected, successful, and not hard on the eyes. Delilah was saved from responding by the arrival of more guests. She used the distraction to slip away, finding a quiet spot near the refreshment table where she could observe without being the subject of speculation. From there, she watched families and couples enjoying the simple pleasures of community, feeling the ache of isolation that had been her constant companion since her father's death. You look like you could use some company. The voice startled her. Turning, she found Xander standing beside her, looking remarkably different in his Sunday best. Without his usual work clothes and hat, he appeared younger, the severity of his reputation softened by his genuine smile. Mr. Hayes, she acknowledged, suddenly conscious of her own modest appearance. I believe I asked you to call me Xander. He offered her a glass of lemonade. May I join you? She hesitated only briefly before nodding. It seems you're determined to regardless of my answer. His laugh was warm and genuine. Guilty as charged, though I promise to leave if you truly wish it. Something in his tone made her believe him, which was perhaps why she found herself saying, You can stay. They stood in companionable silence, watching the gathering. Several people glanced their way, clearly noting the unexpected pairing. I'm afraid I'm making you the subject of gossip, Xander observed. It's too late to worry about that, she replied. According to Mrs. Collins, I've been the topic of speculation since I began working for you. And what terrible things are they saying? He asked, amusement evident in his voice. That you're quite the catch, apparently, she admitted, immediately regretting her candor when she saw the pleased expression that crossed his face. And what do you think of that assessment? He asked, his voice lower. I think, she said carefully, that the opinions of Silverridge's gossips are of little consequence to either of us. Diplomatically stated, he acknowledged, then gestured toward the makeshift dance floor where couples were beginning to gather as a fiddler tuned his instrument. Would you care to dance, Miss Thorne? She should refuse. Dancing with Xander Hayes would only fuel the rumors. Yet the prospect of continuing to stand alone at the edge of the gathering suddenly seemed unbearable. One dance, she conceded. His hand was warm and steady as he led her to the floor. When he placed his other hand lightly at her waist, Delilah felt an unexpected flutter of nerves. The music began, a lively reel that required concentration and coordination. To her surprise, Xander moved with grace, guiding her through the steps with confidence but never overpowering her. You dance well for a rancher, she observed as they circled each other. My mother insisted on lessons, he admitted. She had aspirations of returning to Boston society someday. Did she? A shadow crossed his features. No, she died of fever when I was 15 here in Colorado, far from the city she missed. I'm sorry, Delilah said, genuinely moved by the glimpse of his past. It's hard losing a parent. It is, he agreed as the dance brought them close again. Though I think it made me appreciate this land more, knowing it holds part of her. The music shifted to a slower waltz. Xander's hand tightened slightly at her waist, a silent question. Instead of withdrawing as propriety might dictate, Delilah found herself stepping closer, allowing him to lead her in the more intimate dance. People are watching, she murmured, acutely aware of the eyes following their movements. Let them, he replied simply. I'm enjoying the company of a remarkable woman. Their opinions matter little. The compliment warmed her, but caution remained. Flattery doesn't suit you, Mr. Hayes. It's not flattery when it's truth, he countered, his gaze direct and unguarded. You've impressed me, Delilah Thorne, not just with your ranching skills but with your determination and integrity. Few would fight as hard as you have for their independence. The use of her first name registered, but she found she didn't mind. Independence is all I have. Is it all you want? He asked quietly as the music drew to a close. The question hung between them, loaded with implications she wasn't prepared to consider. Before she could formulate a response, they were interrupted by Sheriff Wilson. Hayes, the lawman nodded respectfully, then turned to Delilah. Miss Thorne, sorry to intrude, but I wanted to let you know the bank manager was looking for you earlier. Seemed important. Concern immediately replaced whatever warmth had been building. Did he say what it was about? No, madam, but he seemed in a hurry to find you. Said something about your payment schedule. Delilah's stomach tightened with dread. She'd made one payment from her wages, but it wasn't due for another week. If there was a problem now. Excuse me, she said to both men, already moving toward the bank manager who stood conversing with the mayor across the churchyard. She was barely aware of Xander following until he spoke. Would you like me to accompany you? That's not necessary, she replied quickly, not wanting him to witness what might be a humiliating conversation about her precarious finances. Delilah. His use of her given name stopped her. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her carefully maintained composure. For so long, she'd carried her burdens without support, convinced that relying on others would compromise the independence she cherished. I appreciate the offer, she said finally, but this is my responsibility. He didn't argue, merely nodded with respect. I'll be here if you change your mind. The conversation with the bank manager was brief but devastating. Due to an error in their records, her payment had been credited to the wrong account. The mistake had been discovered, but in the interim, foreclosure proceedings had been initiated. She now had only 10 days to produce the full remaining balance, an impossible sum, even with her wages from Hayes. Delilah maintained her composure throughout the exchange, thanking the manager for the information with a calm she didn't feel. Only when she walked away, moving purposefully toward her horse, did the panic truly set in. Everything she'd worked for, everything her family had built, would be lost because of a clerical error. Delilah. Xander's voice reached her as she untied her mare from the hitching post. What happened? She didn't turn, unwilling to let him see the tears threatening to fall. Nothing that concerns you, Mr. Hayes. Clearly it does, he persisted, moving to stand beside her. You're pale as a ghost. The bank made a mistake with my payment, she admitted finally. They're foreclosing in 10 days unless I can pay the full amount, understanding dawned in his eyes. How much? $430. The sum felt enormous, impossible. "I can lend you the money," he said immediately. She stiffened, pride rising like a shield. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Hayes." "It's not charity," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "It's a loan from one rancher to another that I have no way to repay in any reasonable time frame," she countered. "Then consider it an investment." He placed his hand over hers where it gripped the saddle, the touch sending unexpected warmth through her despite her distress. "I believe in what you're building, Delilah. Let me help." "Why?" she demanded, finally meeting his gaze. "Why would you risk so much on my failing ranch?" "Because he hesitated, then continued with careful words. "Because I respect what you're fighting for. And because I believe you would do the same if our positions were reversed." The truth of his statement struck her. If she had means and saw a neighbor in genuine need, wouldn't she offer assistance? Yet accepting help from Xander felt different, laden with implications she wasn't ready to confront. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course." He stepped back, giving her space. "The offer stands whenever you decide." Delilah rode home in turmoil, torn between pragmatism and pride. Accepting Xander's money would save her ranch, but create a debt financial, and perhaps emotional, she wasn't sure she could bear. Refusing meant losing everything, including the home that held every memory of her parents. The next morning, she rode to the north pasture earlier than usual, hoping physical labor would clear her mind. She found Xander already there, working alongside his men to repair a broken water trough. He straightened when he saw her approach, wiping his hands on his trousers. The other hands discreetly moved away, giving them privacy. "I've thought about your offer," she said without preamble, dismounting to stand before him. "And?" His expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "I can't accept a loan I can't repay," she began, watching his face fall slightly before continuing. "But I would consider a partnership." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Partnership?" "A business arrangement," she clarified. "You provide the capital to clear my debt and make necessary improvements. In exchange, you receive a percentage of profits once the ranch is properly producing again." Xander studied her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's a serious proposition, Miss Thorne." "I'm a serious woman, Mr. Hayes." She met his gaze steadily. "This way, you're not giving charity and I'm not accepting it. It's a business investment with potential returns." "And if there are no returns?" he asked. "Ranching is always a gamble." "Then you have the option to convert your investment to partial ownership," she said, the words difficult but necessary. "Though I reserve the right to buy back any percentage at fair market value when I'm able." He considered this, clearly impressed by the thought she'd put into the arrangement. "You've developed quite the business mind. Necessity is an effective teacher," she replied. "I accept your terms," he said finally, extending his hand. "Partners." She took his hand, the handshake firm and businesslike despite the flutter in her chest. "I'll have the agreement drawn up by Judge Taylor to make it official." "As you wish," he agreed, holding her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Though I hope you know my word is my bond." "In business matters, documentation protects both parties," she said practically. "Indeed." Something in his expression suggested he found her caution amusing rather than offensive. "Though sometimes, Delilah, trust must precede paper." The use of her given name still startled her, especially in the context of their newly formed business relationship. "Trust is earned, Mr. Hayes." "Xander," he corrected gently. "If we're to be partners, perhaps formality can be set aside, at least in private." The request seemed reasonable, yet it represented another small erosion of the barriers she'd carefully constructed. "Very well. Xander." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her cheeks warm. To hide her discomfort, she quickly turned the conversation to ranch matters, outlining her plans for restoring the Thorne property to profitability. The partnership was formalized the following day, with Judge Taylor witnessing their signatures on the carefully worded agreement. The bank manager, initially skeptical, became notably more respectful when Xander Hayes counted out the full sum in cash across his desk. "The debt is cleared, Miss Thorne," he announced, handing her the deed now marked paid in full. "The property remains in your name as specified." "Thank you," she said, the relief of holding the document overwhelming. She turned to find Xander watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, satisfaction mixed with something deeper. Outside the bank, she finally allowed herself a moment of unbridled joy, clutching the deed to her chest. "I never thought this day would come," she admitted. "It's just the beginning," Xander replied. "Now the real work starts," and work they did. Over the next 2 months, the partnership transformed Thorne Ranch. With capital for improvements, Delilah implemented changes she'd only dreamed of: repairing fences, digging a deeper well, purchasing breeding stock with superior bloodlines. Xander visited regularly, offering advice but never overriding her decisions. What surprised her most was how seamlessly they worked together, their different perspectives creating solutions neither would have devised alone. Where she was cautious, he encouraged calculated risks. When he pushed too hard, she provided measured restraint. "We make a good team," he observed one evening as they reviewed the ledger on her porch. The summer sun was setting, painting the landscape in gold and purple. The ranch already looked different, rejuvenated, promising. "We do," she admitted, allowing herself to acknowledge what had become increasingly obvious. "I didn't expect that." "What did you expect?" he asked, setting aside the accounts to give her his full attention. Delilah considered the question. "I expected you to take control, to treat me like the junior partner despite it being my land." "Why would I do that when your expertise with this particular property exceeds mine?" His practical response made her smile. "Besides," he added more softly, "I've come to value your judgment, not just about ranching." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. These moments had become increasingly frequent conversations that drifted from business to personal, looks that lingered longer than necessary, an awareness that hummed between them like electricity before a storm. "It's getting late," she said, suddenly conscious of being alone with him as darkness gathered. "You should head back before it's fully dark." Instead of agreeing, Xander leaned back in his chair, studying her with quiet intensity. "Do I make you uncomfortable, Delilah?" The directness of the question startled her. "I know, of course not." "You're not a convincing liar," he observed, though there was no accusation in his tone. "Whenever our conversations turn personal, you find reasons to end them." She looked away, unable to deny the truth of his statement. "Our partnership is business," she reminded him, as much for herself as for him. "Is that all you want it to be?" The question hung in the warm evening air between them. Delilah's heart raced as she considered how to respond. The truth that her feelings for Xander had grown beyond business respect into something far more complicated seemed too dangerous to acknowledge. "What I want doesn't matter," she finally said. "People would say I was after your money, or that you were taking advantage of my situation." "I don't care what people say," he replied, his voice low and earnest. "I care what you feel, Delilah." When she didn't immediately respond, he stood, moving to the edge of the porch to give her space. The gesture respecting her boundaries even in this moment of tension made her chest ache with unexpected emotion. "I should go," he said quietly. "Think about what I've said. Whatever you decide about us, the partnership remains as agreed. You have my word on that." She watched him ride away, confusion and longing warring within her. The rational part of her mind insisted that romantic entanglement would only complicate their business arrangement. The part of her that had been lonely for so long whispered that perhaps some complications were worth the risk. Sleep eluded her that night as she wrestled with her feelings. By morning, she had made no decision, merely resolved to maintain professional distance until she could sort through her conflicted emotions. That resolution was immediately tested when she arrived at the north pasture to find Xander in heated argument with 3 men she didn't recognize. Their fine Eastern clothes looked out of place against the rugged landscape. "This discussion is over, gentlemen," Xander was saying as she approached. "My answer remains no." The oldest of the 3 men, silver-haired and imperious, spotted her first. "Perhaps we should ask your partner," he suggested with a calculating smile. "Miss Thorne, isn't it?" Xander's expression tightened. "Leave her out of this, Marshal." "Out of what?" Delilah asked, dismounting to stand beside Xander. Despite their personal uncertainty, she wouldn't leave him to face these men alone. "Robert Marshall and Associates." The older man introduced himself with practiced charm. "We represent the Western Colorado Railroad Corporation. We're offering Mr. Hayes a very generous sum for a right-of-way through Double H property." "And my north pasture," Xander added grimly, "which would render it useless for grazing." Understanding dawned. The railroad would bring economic opportunity to the region, but at significant cost to ranchers whose operations would be disrupted by the tracks and increased traffic. "The railroad is progress, Miss Thorne," Marshall continued smoothly. "Progress that would benefit small ranches like yours more than large operations like Hayes's. Connecting to eastern markets could double the value of your cattle." It was a compelling argument, one that appealed to her practical nature. Yet she didn't miss the manipulative strategy attempting to drive a wedge between her and Xander by appealing to her financial interests. "My ranch is small, Mr. Marshall, but not for sale in parts or whole," she replied firmly. "And while I appreciate your insights into my business, I make decisions based on my own judgment, not persuasion from strangers." The man's charm cooled visibly. "Perhaps you should reconsider, both of you. The railroad will come through this valley one way or another. Better to profit from its arrival than stand in its way." "Is that a threat?" Xander asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Merely an observation," Marshall replied. "Good day, Mr. Hayes, Miss Thorne. Our offer remains open for 30 days. As the men departed in their expensive carriage, Delilah turned to Xander. "How long have they been pressuring you?" "Months," he admitted. "They've been buying or leasing land all through the territory. Most small ranchers can't afford to refuse their offers." "Yet you did," she observed. "This land has been in my family for a generation," he said simply. "Some things are worth more than money." The sentiment resonated deeply with Delilah, echoing her own feelings about her family's ranch. In that moment, she recognized a fundamental truth that had been slowly revealing itself over their months of partnership beneath his successful exterior. Xander Hayes shared her core values, her connection to the land, her sense of legacy. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing with me just now." "Always," he replied, the single word carrying weight beyond its simplicity. "Though I wouldn't have blamed you for considering their argument. The railroad would make shipping cattle easier." "At the cost of everything else," she countered. "Some bargains aren't worth making." Their eyes met in shared understanding, and something shifted between them, a barrier dissolving, trust deepening. Before either could speak further, however, a rider approached at full gallop. It was Jenkins, one of Xander's hands, his expression urgent. "Boss, fire at the South Range," he called as he reined in his lathered horse. Looks deliberate started in 3 places at once. Xander's expression hardened. Get the men, tell Jackson to bring the water wagon. He turned to Delilah. This isn't coincidence. Marshal, she agreed, already mounting her horse. I'm coming with you. He didn't waste time arguing, merely nodded as they rode hard toward the rising smoke on the horizon. The South Range bordered Thorne property, which meant her own ranch could be at risk if the flames spread. The fire was vicious, feeding on dry grass and pushed by wind. For hours, they fought alongside Xander's men and neighboring ranchers who came to help. Delilah worked tirelessly, her face blackened with soot as she helped dig fire breaks and beat back flames with wet blankets. By nightfall, the fire was contained, though it had devoured nearly 100 acres of prime grazing land. Exhausted, Delilah sank to the ground beside Xander, who looked as drained as she felt. Your men said they found lamp oil cans near where the fire started, she said quietly, accepting the canteen he offered. Marshal doesn't waste time, Xander replied, his voice rough from smoke. Though he'll ensure nothing can be proven. We can't let him win, she insisted. If we give in to these tactics, we won't, he interrupted, surprising her by taking her hand. His palm was blistered from firefighting, yet his touch was gentle. But I need to know you understand the risk. This is my fight, Delilah. You don't have to make it yours. The implication was clear. Their partnership gave her a legitimate reason to step away, to protect herself and her ranch from Marshall's intimidation tactics. Our fight, she corrected firmly. We're partners, remember. Something flashed in his eyes, relief, gratitude, and something deeper that made her breath catch. Partners, he agreed, his thumb tracing a small circle on her palm. The next weeks brought escalating tensions. Though no more fires were set, other incidents occurred. Cattle mysteriously spooked from pastures. A vital spring suddenly polluted with coal oil. Threats delivered to hands working the boundary lines. Through it all, Xander and Delilah presented a united front. They increased patrols, hired additional hands, and made it clear to neighboring ranchers that resistance to the railroad's tactics would be stronger together than individually. What Delilah hadn't anticipated was how the shared adversity would dissolve the remaining barriers between them. Working side by side against a common enemy, their cautious partnership evolved into something far more personal. Conversations extended into evenings, professional respect deepened into admiration, and the awareness that had always hummed between them grew impossible to ignore. Yet neither spoke of it directly, as if naming the feeling might somehow break the delicate balance they'd achieved, until the night of the harvest dance. Silverridge's annual celebration brought the entire county together at the town hall. Ranchers and townspeople, wealthy and struggling alike, setting aside differences to mark another year's end. Delilah attended without expectation, wearing her mother's best dress, which she'd carefully altered. She hadn't arranged to meet Xander, yet found herself watching for him nonetheless. When he finally appeared, the familiar flutter in her chest confirmed what she'd been avoiding. Acknowledging her feelings had grown far beyond business partnership or even friendship. He spotted her immediately, making his way through the crowd with single-minded purpose that drew curious glances. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he reached her, no preamble or social niceties. "Thank you," she replied, uncharacteristically shy beneath his direct gaze. "You clean up well yourself. May I have this dance?" he asked as the music began, a slow waltz that would put them in closer proximity than propriety might approve. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "People will talk." "Let them," he said, echoing his words from months ago as he led her to the floor. This time, The sentiment felt different, less dismissive of convention and more deliberately chosen despite it. As they moved together, the room seemed to fade around them. Xander held her with careful respect, yet there was nothing impersonal in his touch or the way his eyes remained fixed on hers. "I've been thinking about what Marshall said," he said quietly. "About the railroad coming through the valley regardless of our resistance." The unexpected topic jolted her. "You're not considering his offer." "No," he assured her, "but I've been considering alternatives, ways to benefit from the railroad without sacrificing our land." The casual use of "our" wasn't lost on her. "What alternatives?" "A spur line," he explained. "One that we control, connecting our ranches to the main line but on our terms. We could offer access to other ranchers for a fee." The idea was brilliant, turning potential defeat into opportunity. "That would require significant capital," she observed. "Yes," he acknowledged. "More than either of us has individually. But together," she began, understanding his direction. "Together, with loans against our combined properties, it's possible." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "It would mean a more permanent partnership, Delilah." The implication hung between them as the music slowed. Before she could respond, the dance ended, and the moment was broken by the arrival of Sheriff Wilson. "Hayes," he said urgently, "Thorne Ranch is burning." The words struck like physical blows. Without waiting for details, Delilah was already moving toward the door, Xander close behind her. They mounted their horses and rode hard through the night, the glow of flames visible from miles away as they approached. Her home, the house her grandfather had built, where she'd been born, where her parents had lived and died, was fully engulfed by the time they arrived. Neighbors who had seen the flames had come to help, but it was clear the structure couldn't be saved. "The barn," she gasped, spurring her horse toward the building where her cattle and horses were kept. Xander was already ahead of her, organizing men to soak the roof and walls with water from the well to prevent the fire from spreading. For hours they worked, saving the barn and corrals, but helpless to do more than watch as the house collapsed into smoldering ruins. By dawn, Delilah stood amid the ashes of her childhood home, numb with shock and exhaustion. "This was Marshall," Xander said, his voice tight with controlled fury as he joined her. "I'll make sure he pays for this." "How?" she asked dully. "We can't prove anything." "I'll find a way," he promised. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. You'll stay at the Double H until we can rebuild." The offer of shelter barely registered through her grief. All she could see was loss: the quilt her mother had made, her father's books, the family Bible with generations of births and deaths recorded inside. All gone, reduced to char and ash. "Delilah." Xander's voice broke through her stupor, his hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, finding fierce determination there. "This isn't the end," he said firmly. "We'll rebuild better than before. Marshall thought this would break us, force us to sell. He doesn't understand what he's dealing with." "I have nothing left," she whispered. "That's not true." His hands moved to frame her face with unexpected tenderness. "You have the land, you have your strength, and you have me if you want me." The last words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate crisis. Through her grief, Delilah recognized the moment for what it was: Xander offering not just practical assistance but himself, completely. "I don't want your charity," she muttered, the words lacking conviction even as she spoke them. "It's not charity when it's love," he responded, voice low and certain. "I love you, Delilah Thorne. I think I have since the day you stood on your porch and refused my help with such fierce independence." The declaration stunned her. She'd known their relationship had evolved beyond business, had even acknowledged her own growing feelings, but hearing him state it so plainly, especially now, amid destruction seemed almost unreal. "This isn't the time," she began. "It's exactly the time," he interrupted gently. "When everything else is stripped away, what matters becomes clear. You matter to me. More than business, more than land, more than anything." Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I have nothing to offer you now." "You have everything I want," he countered, his thumbs gently wiping her tears. "Your courage, your intelligence, your heart. Say you'll marry me, Delilah. Let's build something together that no fire can destroy." The proposal, unexpected yet somehow inevitable, pierced through her grief with a ray of hope. In Xander's eyes, she saw not pity but genuine love and respect, the same emotions that had been growing in her own heart, despite her attempts to deny them. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of transformation. From independence to partnership, from resistance to acceptance, from loss to new beginning. His kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, mindful of their surroundings yet unashamed of declaring their commitment before the witnesses gathering to help. News of the engagement spread through the county as rapidly as word of the fire had. Some whispered it was convenience or desperation on Delilah's part, but those who had watched their partnership develop over months recognized the genuine bond between them. They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Double H Ranch, attended by neighbors and friends who had rallied to support them. Delilah wore a new dress that Martha Wilson had helped her make, carrying wildflowers gathered from Thorne land. "I take this woman," Xander vowed before the traveling preacher, "to love and cherish, to support but never diminish, to stand beside but never behind." The unconventional vows drew murmurs of surprise from some guests, but Delilah's heart swelled at the public acknowledgement of her equality in their partnership. "I take this man," she responded clearly, "to love and respect, to challenge and strengthen, to build with rather than depend upon." Their kiss sealed promises that went beyond traditional marriage, establishing the foundation of a relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered new dimensions to their partnership: tenderness where there had been reserve, vulnerability where there had been guardedness, passion where there had been caution. In Xander's arms, Delilah found not the loss of independence she had feared, but a different kind of freedom, the liberty to share her strengths and weaknesses with someone who valued both equally. The next morning they rode together to survey the ruins of Thorne Ranch, now legally their joint property. Amid the ashes, Delilah found a single item that had survived the fire: her mother's silver hand mirror, its surface tarnished but intact. "A sign," Xander said, helping her polish it with his handkerchief. "Something beautiful preserved through destruction." "Like us," she replied softly, seeing their reflection together for the first time, no longer separate individuals but a united pair. The rebuilding began that day, with plans not just to replace what was lost, but to create something new and stronger. The new house would be larger, designed for a family they both hoped would grow. The ranch operations would expand, combining Thorne traditions with Hayes innovations. Robert Marshall made one final attempt to force their hand, approaching with a reduced offer and thinly veiled threats about the consequences of continued resistance. "Your position is precarious, Mrs. Hayes," he said, deliberately using her married name as if to emphasize her new dependency. "One ranch already destroyed, another vulnerable. The railroad has powerful friends in territorial government." Delilah exchanged a glance with Xander before addressing Marshall directly. "Mr. Marshall, before you continue, you should know that Sheriff Wilson is currently examining evidence linking your associates to recent fires in the county." The man's confidence faltered slightly. Baseless accusations. Perhaps, Xander interjected calmly. But several of your hired men have suddenly become talkative, particularly after we offered better wages and protection from prosecution for information. It was a calculated bluff, based on suspicions rather than concrete evidence, but Marshall's visible discomfort suggested it struck close to truth. Furthermore, Delilah continued, we've submitted a proposal to the territorial legislature for an alternative route for the railroad, one that serves the community's interests rather than just your shareholders. With the backing of every major rancher in the county, Xander added. It seems your strong-arm tactics have united those you hope to divide. Marshall's face reddened with anger. This isn't over. Actually, Delilah replied with newfound confidence, I believe it is. Good day, Mr. Marshall. The railroad eventually came through Silverridge, but on terms negotiated by the community rather than imposed by Eastern interests. The Hayes-Thorne spur line became a profitable venture, providing both ranches with reliable access to markets while preserving the integrity of their grazing lands. 1 year after the fire, Delilah stood on the porch of their new home, watching as Xander returned from town with supplies. Her hand rested lightly on her swelling belly, where their first child grew tangible proof of the future they were building together. Good news from town, he called as he dismounted. The bank approved our loan for the new breeding stock. That is good news, she agreed, accepting his kiss as he joined her on the porch, though not as significant as what I have to tell you. His eyebrows rose questioningly. Doctor. Miller confirms we'll be welcoming twins in the spring, she said, unable to contain her smile at his expression of stunned delight. Twins, he repeated, placing his hand over hers on her stomach. 2 babies at once. Apparently they run in my mother's family, she explained. Are you prepared for double the challenge, Mr. Hayes? His laugh was joyful as he gathered her in his arms. With you as my partner, Mrs. Hayes, I'm prepared for anything. Looking out over their combined land, Double H Ranch to the north, Thorne Ranch rising anew to the south, Delilah felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible when she'd first stood alone, facing foreclosure and an uncertain future. I'm glad I accepted your help that day, she admitted, leaning into his embrace, even if I was too proud to recognize it as more than charity. And I'm glad you taught me the difference between offering assistance and offering respect, he replied, his voice warm against her hair. We've both learned from each other. In the years that followed, their partnership flourished in business, in family, in love. Their twins, a boy and girl with their father's green eyes and their mother's determination, grew alongside the ranch, learning the value of hard work and mutual support. The Hayes-Thorne operation became one of the most successful in Colorado territory, known for innovative practices and fair dealings. Yet those who knew them best understood that their greatest achievement wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the relationship. They'd built a true partnership of equals, founded on respect and deepened by love. When asked the secret to their success, Xander would often smile and say simply, "We discovered the difference between charity and love." And Delilah, her hand in his, would add, "And learned that independence doesn't have to mean standing alone." Together, they created a legacy far stronger than either could have built individually, proof that the most powerful partnerships begin when pride gives way to love, and 2 independent spirits choose to become something greater than the sum of their parts.